everybody. Today we'll be discussing the economic way of thinking. And this narration is to help you with your distance learning of this course. Please feel free to pause the narration by clicking on the picture of my face. You should be able to see a little picture of my face down here in the corner. You can click on that to pause the narration at any point. On this slide, we'll give an overview of the topics that we're covering in this lesson. That is, what is economics? A general definition of the subject. The economic problem. 3 big economic questions. Economics assumptions. This word assumption means things that we take as being true. You assume something is true if you take it as being true in order to make progress in your thinking. We'll talk about the marginal principle. This word margin means the edge. You'll be familiar with the margin of a page being down here. And it's the origin of this word, the margin, the marginal principle. Okay. We'll then talk about one of the most important concepts in economics, if not the most important, opportunity cost, and how it relates to trade-offs. What is a trade-off? A trade-off is where you give up one thing in order to get something else. So you make a sacrifice of one thing in order to get something else. And that's very much related to this concept of opportunity cost. What is economics? Economics is the study of choices in the presence of scarcity. Scarcity means something that there isn't enough for all of the wants that people have. So in order to think about what items are scarce, it's often helpful to think about things that are not scarce. So a good example of that, would you pause the video and try and think of that? We'll talk about it in the next slide. Economics can generally be divided into 2 branches. Microeconomics, micro meaning small, and it's looking at the subject of economics from the small scale of looking at the interactions of peoples and individual companies. And macroeconomics. Macro means big, and it means we look at economics from a top-level view, looking at the aggregate effect on a nation, a country, and this would be things like the GDP of a country, or we'll also be talking about things like fiscal policy or monetary policy, things that concern a large top-level view of economics. Okay, so that's the detail that we're giving here. The behavior of individuals and firms meaning companies, that will be the subject of microeconomics, and the behavior of nations or economic factors when viewed in the aggregate, a large number of companies and people together, will be macroeconomics. We will spend the first half of the semester talking about microeconomics, and we'll be spending the second half of the semester talking about macroeconomics. The economics problem. So human beings have limited resources, but unlimited wants. This in economics is referred to as scarcity. So this idea of something being scarce means that people want more of it than exists. So again, on the next slide, we'll talk about scarcity in a bit more detail. At the moment, just try to think about things that are scarce, things that there's not enough of, or that you could do with having more of, or there are people who want more of that item. Okay, if somebody wants more of a thing and they can't have it, it is scarce. Okay, economics as a field of study came to respond to the scarcity problem. So it's trying to understand how is it determined who gets the resources and how much of those resources each individual gets. How is that worked out between all the individuals in a society? That is the field of study of economics. Okay, and again on the next slide, we're going to think about things that are scarce and things that are not scarce in different contexts. Get ready for that slide. Try and think of a thing that is not scarce. If it's not scarce, it will not be subject to the ideas that we develop in the subject of economics. Okay, so it's not a matter of study for the subject of economics if it's not scarce. Okay, examples on scarcity. We're going to now talk about some things that are scarce and some things that are not scarce. We're going to look at it in a little bit of detail and how even in different places you could consider some things as being scarce and some things as being not scarce in a different place. So for example, in this nice picture here, we see a place where clean air might be considered scarce. So it might be valuable for someone here in this polluted place to be able to go somewhere with clean air. They might be willing to exchange other opportunities, and they might be willing to pay money to go somewhere with clean air. In general, air is my favorite example of something that is not scarce. Okay, so in general, most places you go on the planet Earth, there is enough air for everybody's needs. So in general, you will not be willing to pay money for air. You will not be able to trade something for air. There are a few exceptions. One of my students mentioned that at the bottom of the sea, you'll be willing to pay money for air in a tank. At the top of Mount Everest, you'll be willing to pay money for air. So air is scarce in a few places, but in general, it's not considered scarce, and it will not be subject to the ideas developed in the subject of economics. We'll not be considering air. Even though it's very important, you need air or you will die. So it is a very, very important resource, but it is just in plentiful supply. There's lots of it, and people don't generally pay money for air. On the other hand, in Bahrain, rainwater is considered scarce. So there is not enough rainwater to supply all of the needs and wants for water in Bahrain. What does that mean? That means a farmer who wishes to grow crops, for example, may have to pay for the water that they need to grow the crops in Bahrain. In some parts of the world, like in Ireland, for example, where I'm from, rainwater is in plentiful supply. There is more than enough rainwater to meet the wants of people. Now, treated water might be different. You might have to pay for treated water that you can drink. But in general, farmers in Ireland will not pay for water for their crops. It is abundant. There is lots of it, and everybody has enough. So in Ireland, rainwater would not be considered relevant to the study of economics, whereas in Bahrain, it is relevant to the study of economics because it is not in plentiful enough supply for everybody to have as much as they would ideally want. So the three big economic questions are: what goods and services will be produced? How will the goods and services be produced? And who will receive the goods and services that are produced? So what, how, and who. These are the three big economic questions. And if you think about it, if you had to plan the answers for all of these three questions, it would be very difficult. what things should be produced in a country, how will those things be produced, and who will receive those things. That would be a very difficult thing for an individual person to plan. But fortunately, in a free market economic system, these questions are generally answered through the prices of things and individual free decisions that people make. So it's very interesting to study these three big economic questions. In order to begin our studies to understand those three economic questions, we first need to make some assumptions. Now remember, an assumption is something we take as being true. Even if sometimes it's not true, in order to make progress in the field of economics, we need to consider that some things are true. Okay? If something that we assume to be true turns out in some cases not to be true, then the behavior of people might not exactly line up with what is predicted by economic theory. Okay? So it's very important to understand what these three assumptions are. The first assumption is that people are rational. Rational means that they are reasonable. They take a reasoned and logical approach to their decision making. Okay? They don't just act randomly. They don't just respond to their emotions. They think things through and make decisions logically on a rational basis. The second assumption is that people respond to incentives, okay, including disincentives. The word disincentive is just the opposite. It's an incentive to do something less, perhaps. So an incentive, an easy example of an incentive that you might think of is how much money you're being paid to do a job. If you're offered more money for one job than for another job, you might respond to that incentive by choosing the more highly paid job. Now, you might have more criteria that you consider. You might consider how much time it takes you to do that job, for example, or how happy you feel doing that job. But these are also incentives that you might respond to. So you might have more time, that might be an incentive, or you might have more satisfaction or happiness doing a job, that might be an incentive for you. And also for things that you might want to buy, for example, you might respond to the price. It might be a disincentive that the price is very high. So if you have a very highly priced car, you might be put off from buying that and instead choose a more low-priced car. Okay, so you might respond to incentives. Not just money, but money is a good example to think about how incentives affect your decisions. Okay. The third idea is a little bit more difficult to understand, and we'll talk about it in more detail at a later slide, but it is the idea that people make their decisions at the margin. So this term, at the margin, means the next thing that you want to get, or the next thing that you want to do, and the next hour that you want to spend your time on at work, for example, that is at the margin, and you'll be making decisions at the margin. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail on a further slide. So what does it mean to be rational? What does it mean to be reasonable and logical in how you make a decision? So below we have a schematic path of 8 steps you might take before making a decision rationally. Okay, so the first thing you might do is identify the problem. Establish a decision criteria. How are you going to make your decision? Weigh the decision criteria. So for example, if you're going to buy the packet of crisps that cost you the least amount of money, the criteria would be which one costs the least. If you're going to weigh that decision, you will calculate the cost of each packet of crisps. Okay? Generate alternatives. So in our example of a packet of crisps, you're going to look at all the different packets of crisps in the shops. Evaluate the alternatives. Find out how do each of these alternatives meet your criteria. Remember, the criteria might not just be cost. It could be more complex criteria, but as long as you're making your decision based on a certain criteria and you're not just making random decisions, then you are being rational. Okay? Choose the best alternative. You're trying to make the best choice. If you're being rational, you will choose the best choice. You won't just choose the choice that is worst for your own self-interest based on the criteria that you've laid out. Okay? Implement the decision. So you've made your decision, and then evaluate your decision. Have you made the right choice at the end? That could be a very useful 8-step process for you to go through if you want to ensure that you are rational. In general, being rational means that you're using reason and logical part of your brain to make your decisions. You're not being random, just flip a coin to make a decision, and you're not being emotional and unreasonable in the way you make your decisions. The second assumption being that people respond to incentives. We've got a lovely picture here of the easiest incentive to think of, being money. But of course, there are lots of other things that might incentivize you to choose one thing over another thing, to make a decision to do one thing over another thing. Okay, so time could be an example of an incentive. You could get more time if you make one choice. For example, if you choose to take a taxi instead of taking the bus, you could have saved yourself a bunch of time, even though it cost you more money. So the incentive there might be time. Okay, so incentives are rewards that motivate people to behave in a certain way. And in economics, we assume that people respond to these incentives. So the opposite of an incentive is a disincentive. A disincentive is where there is a system that tries to discourage you from doing something. And really, it's just two words that are opposites of each other. So an example of a disincentive being a library fine. They want to discourage you from keeping your books over the due time. So if you go over the due time for your book to be returned, you must pay a fine. You'll have to pay money. That fine can be considered a disincentive. And in economics, we would assume that most people will be discouraged from keeping their books over the due time if they're issued with a fine when they go over the due time for returning their book. So our third assumption is that people make decisions at the margin. And I mentioned earlier that we would cover this idea in a little bit more detail. So this slide is covering this idea in a little bit more detail. I find this idea is best understood with examples. So in general, we're talking about now that we like to think about how a small change in one variable will affect another variable and what impact that will have on people's decision making. So that's a little bit abstract, more easily understood with an example. So what do we mean? What do you have to ask yourself? Would a 1 unit increase in a particular variable make me or my business or my family or my community better off? Okay. Now the example I like to use is if you have a stand selling bottles of water in the middle of the desert, in the middle of Bahrain's desert, and they're charging you 10 BD for a bottle of water. You really have to ask yourself in this context, will one more bottle of water make me better off, or will keeping the 10 BD make me better off? Okay, so for the first bottle of water, you could say to yourself, well, if I don't get that bottle of water, I'm going to die. Yeah, so definitely I'll be willing to trade 10 BD for the first bottle of water. I'll be better off with the bottle of water and without that 10 BD. The second bottle of water, I'll be thinking to myself, well, how big is this desert in Bahrain? How far can I get? Should I carry one bottle of water with me so that I can get out of the desert and back to where there's other shops and civilization? Okay, probably I'll buy the second bottle of water. It's a good idea. I'll be better off with the second bottle of water without the second 10 BD. By the third bottle of water, I'm thinking, well, when I get back to civilization, which I should be able to do with these 2 bottles of water that I've just bought, I'll be better off with the 10 BD. I'll keep this 10 BD and I can use it to buy lots of things. Maybe lots of bottles of water, but maybe other things that I want or need. So at the margin, one more bottle of water, it will make me better off, but not better off as much as keeping the 10 BD. So I'm going to buy 2 bottles of water. That's my decision. Okay. Another very good example is when you're eating. So the example here is talking about eating peanuts. But you can think about an example when you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet. That might be another good example. When you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet, you pick the first plate full of food, you're hungry, and you think this plate full of food is going to make you better off. You're going to satisfy your hunger. Okay? You've satisfied your hunger, you go back up to the buffet, and this time you're thinking, oh, the taste. I'm going to enjoy the taste a little bit more. I'm going to have a second plate full of food from the buffet. But by the third plate full of food, you're starting to get really, really full, and you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to feel sick. The cost of this third plate full of food, remember in this case example, you've already paid for all you can eat, so it's not going to cost you any money, but it's going to make you feel pretty ill to have this third plate full of food. And you might start to gain weight, for example. So you might decide that the marginal cost, the cost on this third plate of food, now exceeds the benefit of this third plate of food. So the peanuts is a very, very good example, because when you start eating peanuts, you don't know exactly how many peanuts you're going to eat. Nobody says to themselves, today I'm going to eat exactly 83 peanuts. That doesn't really happen. But what does happen is you eat 1. And in each instance of eating 1 more peanut, you say to yourself, does the benefit of this 1 more peanut outweigh the cost of this 1 more peanut? And we're not just talking about the financial cost of peanuts. We're not just talking about money. We're talking about the cost of perhaps feeling full, perhaps gaining weight. Each extra peanut you get is less and less beneficial to you. Okay? So there is a principle in economics which is called the law of diminishing marginal returns. Or diminishing marginal utility, I should say. And that law just describes the fact that oftentimes the first peanut that you ate, or the first unit of any particular item that you wanted, you really benefited from that a lot. You had a very high utility, a high benefit from having the first bottle of water that you bought when you're in the middle of the desert. The second bottle of water had a slightly less benefit. It was of slightly less benefit. It had slightly lower utility, we might say. And by the third bottle of water, the utility was dropping enough that you weren't willing to spend this 10 BD for the third bottle of water. So we have this law in economics of diminishing marginal utility. Basically saying that more and more of an item that you get, you will benefit from it less for each additional item that you have until you have enough, or until you're not willing to incur the cost of the next additional item, be that 10 BD for the bottle of water, or the feeling of fullness for the third plateful of your all-you-can-eat buffet, or the feeling of fullness and the weight gained by the 84th peanut that you decided not to eat. Okay. So another example of thinking at the margin could be trying to decide how best to use your time. Time could be considered a resource that is in limited supply. So it is a valuable resource, and it's worth considering time in the subject of economics. So when you are coming up to an exam and you have been watching TV for a number of hours, you have to decide what is the best use of your time. Is it to watch one more hour of TV, or is it to spend the next hour studying? Now, how do you make that decision can depend on how you've been spending your time up to that point. Let's say you've already spent a significant amount of time watching TV. You've seen your favorite programs and you're getting kind of bored of watching more TV. At that point, one more hour of TV will be less valuable to you than one more hour spent studying. Okay? So you can feel that the benefit you're gaining from spending the next hour watching TV is less than the benefit you gained on the previous hours. And because the amount of available time before your exam is getting less and less, the benefit you gain from studying is becoming more and more. So at a certain point, the benefit of studying will outweigh the benefit of watching TV. So the cost of continuing to watch TV is the fact that you're not able to spend that hour studying. That's what we will call an opportunity cost. And we'll go into an opportunity cost in more detail on a later slide. This slide is an example for you to think about decision making at the margin. Okay, so you have to fill in the blanks and answer the question. What is the marginal benefit? What is the marginal cost? So first, if I keep the shop open one more hour, so we're talking about time here, how much will my blank increase? So fill in the blank. What is the marginal benefit? What is the marginal cost? If I hire one more salesperson, how many more blank could we sell? Fill in the blank and then ask yourself, what is the marginal benefit of one more salesperson? What is the marginal cost? So here we'll talk a little bit more detail about how the marginal principle is applied. And we'll, in a later slide, talk about an example of a company, a firm, some decision making that they might make using this marginal principle. Okay, so how is it applied? Increase the level of an activity as long as the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. Once the marginal benefit no longer exceeds the marginal cost, then you will stop increasing that level of activity. Okay, that's a bit abstract. The level of activity could be, will become a lot more clear what we mean by that with an example. Okay, so when possible, choose the level at which the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. That is because for each additional unit, the marginal benefit is going down. So at the start, the benefit, remember the benefit of the water bottle exceeded the cost, which was the 10 BD. Okay. For each additional unit you increase, the marginal benefit decreases. And typically the marginal cost, on the other hand, for each additional unit, the marginal cost will increase. So at a certain point, the cost will exceed the benefit. Okay, so where do we stop? We stop at the point where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. So a nice example to illustrate the point could be the decision on whether or not to produce one more movie sequel. Now, why is this a nice example? Well, the idea is that the benefit for the company that makes the movie is how much money they make from the movie. So for each movie, the money that they make is getting less and less and less. Okay, so there is this decreasing benefit from making each movie. Okay. On the other hand, the actors are asking for more and more money for each movie that is made. So the cost of each additional movie becomes more and more and more. So we have a benefit that is decreasing at the margin. We have marginal benefit decreasing, and we have a cost that is increasing at the margin. At a certain point, if the cost is going to be greater than the benefit, it will not be worth making another movie. So in our movie example, typically each sequel is generating about 30% less revenues. Okay, so each additional movie is making less revenue because people are getting a little bit bored of this franchise. Okay. At the same time, the actors usually, so it's just a typical thing that happens, demand higher salaries for each additional movie. They're realizing their value and they're asking for higher salaries. Okay. So at a certain point, the cost of making the movie will exceed the benefit, how much profit the movie, how much revenue, how much money in the movie will make. And the movie will be loss-making. At that point, it will not be worth making the movie. This is the example illustrated with a graph. So the first movie, number 1, we can see that the benefit was the revenues. It was $300 million. That's the amount of money that came in. The cost was how much they paid. All of the actors and all of the people working on the movie, and that was less than the benefit. So it was a profitable movie. Okay, they took in 300 million and they spent out 125 million. But for the second sequel, we can see that, the second movie, we can see that over here, the benefit has decreased. There's less money coming in, less revenue, and at the same time the cost has increased. But it's still worth making the movie because the benefit exceeds the cost. It would be a profitable movie, this movie number 2. But if things continue like this, fewer people go to the third movie, there will be a smaller revenue, less money coming in. The benefit of the third movie is less, but at the same time the actors are saying, give me more money. For the third movie in this example, the cost has increased to be higher than the benefit, higher than the revenues coming in. So in this example, if you knew this in advance, you would say, no, it's not a good idea to make this third movie. We will lose money if we make this third movie because the costs have been increasing and the benefit has been decreasing. So another excellent example of decision making at the margin is a company that has to decide how many security guards to hire. Here it says police officers, but security that is working to prevent crime. The idea is that each security guard will prevent a certain amount of crime, and the crime that they have prevented is the benefit of hiring that security guard. The salary of the security guard is the cost to the company of having that security guard. So the table here lays out the benefit of each security guard and the cost of each security guard. And the question for you is to decide how many security guards the shop should hire. Okay? If we look at the first security guard, we can see that he prevents $250,000 worth of crime. And the cost to the company is the salary of the security guard, in this case, $30,000, $750,000. The second security guard prevents much less crime because the easy crimes have already been prevented by the first security guard. So the benefit is decreasing. We have this decreasing marginal utility to the firm of hiring a second security guard. Okay, the salary remains the same, but if we look at the third security guard, the salary, the cost to the company has started to go up, and that's because the third security guard refused the job offer at the beginning. The earlier security guards had accepted a slightly lower salary, but the third security guard insisted on a slightly higher salary of this time $31,000, but he's only preventing $50,000 worth of crime. So the question for you is, how many security guards should the firm hire? How many security guards should the shop hire, and why? Explain that in terms of economic principles. So the answer is that the shop should keep on hiring more security guards until the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. If the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, it's not worth hiring the security guard if the benefit is less than the cost. So looking back at the table before, you could see that at 6 police officers or 6 security guards, the benefit is becoming less than the cost of hiring the security guards. But at 5 security guards, the benefit is still greater than the cost of hiring security guards. So the mall, the shop, should hire 5 security guards. So more things that economics is built on. So we have mentioned before assumptions, and the fact that assumptions means things that we take as being true. We also mentioned 3 assumptions which are generally taken to be true in economics. That is, that people are rational, that they respond to incentives, and that decision making is made at the margin. Assumptions are a very important thing to understand because assumptions are always needed in order to build models. Models are descriptions of reality, sometimes represented mathematically, but they're often simplified descriptions of reality. The real world and the interactions between all people in the world is often too complex to describe in a way that is true for every instance all the time. So in economics, we often like to simplify by making assumptions. Typically, we try to isolate 2 variables. So that is to see the relationship between 2 economic variables. How, for example, does the one of the variables affect the other one? Now, In the real world, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of variables that are all affect each other, all interact with each other. When we say we're only going to consider these two things, how they affect each other, we often use the term ceteris paribus, which is a Latin phrase, and it just means all else being equal, meaning we're going to consider these two variables and we're not going to consider a third variable and how it affects these two variables. So let's take an example of that, isolating two variables. In a later week, we will be spending a lot of time talking about supply and demand, and you'll be drawing these supply and demand curves. And the two variables that are involved when we're talking about these supply and demand curves are the price, that is usually depicted on the y-axis here, and the quantity, the number of the items, usually depicted on the x-axis here. And we'll be considering how a change in price will affect the quantity that is demanded, or how a quantity supplied will affect the price. And that, in that instance, we'll want to forget about all other things. So if we're talking about the quantity of tomatoes that are grown in a given month, we'll want to discount, not consider, the quantity of cucumbers or something different. We'll want to describe how the price might be affected by the quantity of tomatoes supplied. We might not want to consider if it was sunny that month, if it was cold that month, if there was a sale for chickens, which people might cook together with their tomatoes. That might all affect the price, but we want to not consider those things because it would make the situation too complex to describe the world in terms of a simple model. And that's what we like to do in economics, describe the world with some kind of model of reality. So one of the most important concepts, if not the most important concept in economics, is this idea of opportunity cost. And this is a phrase that we really should spend a little bit of time trying to understand what it means. It is a cost, but specifically an opportunity cost is the thing that you give up when you choose to do something. So take, for example, the fact that you have chosen to spend your time watching this presentation and learning economics. If you were not doing that, you could be spending your time doing something else, maybe watching TV. Okay, so let's say the second best thing that you could have been doing with your time is watching TV. Well, you're giving up watching TV in order to spend time learn economics. Okay, so this thing that you're giving up, the time spent watching TV, is a cost. It's the opportunity cost. It's the thing that you're giving up. And it's very closely related, this idea of opportunity cost is very closely related to the idea of a trade-off. A trade-off is when you choose something at the cost of something else, that you cannot do all things. Okay. So, the opportunity cost, I want you to memorize this definition. The opportunity cost is the value of the best alternative that you have not chosen. Okay. So it's important to try and think about some examples of opportunity cost, because it can be sometimes a little bit hidden in your analysis of things. Okay, so in economics we believe that everything has a cost. Okay, and we're not just talking about the monetary cost, how much money something costs, but also the hidden cost of the action that could have been done, but you chose not to do when you chose your particular action, or you made your particular choice. So that's a little bit abstract, a little bit easier to think about an example. If you open a shop in your garage, you might think to yourself, well, there was no cost of using the garage for my shop because it's my garage. I don't have to pay any rent for it. I own this garage. Okay? But economists consider that there is a cost. There's always a cost. Okay? The cost is the opportunity cost. What you could have used this garage for if you were not to open a shop in your garage. Okay? So as an example, it could be that your second best choice for what to use your garage for would be to rent it to somebody else. In that case, the opportunity cost would be the rental income that you're giving up by not renting out your garage and instead using it for your shop. Okay? So when you want to identify the opportunity cost, identify what would the next best choice be that you have to give up in order to make a certain choice. In this example, your choice is opening a shop in your garage. The next best choice would have been to rent out the garage. So the opportunity cost is the rental income that you have given up, that you have chosen not to take. So we can see that this concept of opportunity cost is very closely related to the concept of scarcity, and we can also phrase it in the term of trade-off. Okay? So why is it related to scarcity? The garage that you were using for your shop, you only had one of them. So if you use that garage to open a shop, you cannot use it to rent it out. It is a scarce resource. You're using it for one function and not for another function. Okay? Some other examples might be of the scarce resource of your time. That was the example I was giving of spending your time learning economics. You are necessarily giving up the second best use of your time, which might have been to watch TV. So if you take a part-time job, then what you're choosing to do is spend an hour working at the part-time job, and you might get money. But that hour is a valuable and scarce resource. You could have spent that hour studying, or you could have spent it playing games on a computer. Or so you have made a trade-off. Your time, you've decided to spend it in exchange for money rather than spending it studying or playing. So if your second best option was studying, let's say, then 1 hour of study was the opportunity cost of taking that part-time job for 1 hour. Okay? Another example of a limited resource and how this can lead to trade-offs is land. So if a city uses land for a park, it necessarily has one fewer units of land for housing, for shops, or for industry. So there's a trade-off. You get one more unit of land for a park, you will have one fewer units of land for housing. Okay? So if housing was your second best choice and the park was your first choice, then the opportunity cost of opening a park was a certain amount of land for housing. Okay? Another example is, of course, money. Money might be considered a scarce resource. So if you spend 500 BD of your money on a TV, then you do not have that 500 BD to spend towards a new car. Okay? So if your second choice was using it towards a new car, and your first choice was a TV, it says TV in there, then the opportunity cost is having 500 more BD towards a car. Okay. Okay, so now there are some exercises for you to think about trade-offs that you made recently. Okay, you might not have anybody sitting nearby, but you could write it down or just say it to yourself. Okay, what trade-off did you make recently? Okay, example of a trade-off might be a colleague who decided to skip lunch to save the 1 BD. That was what they gained. They gained the 1 BD, but it cost them the feeling of being hungry. Okay, so that was an example of a trade-off. So for an example on opportunity cost, we will present you with two options. One option is to work for 10 hours a week at Lulu's for 3 BD per hour. The second option is to work for 12 hours a week in your uncle's shop for 2.5 BD per hour, but you also get a free cake and pizza. And you might prefer working with your uncle than working in Lulu's, perhaps. Okay. So the thing for you to think about these options, if you chose option A, okay, option A. If you chose option A, what was the opportunity cost? Okay, we'll give the answer on the next slide. If, on the other hand, you chose option B, what was the opportunity cost? Okay. Now, this question is not asking you which option is the best option. What it's asking you is, in two different cases, if you chose option A, what was the opportunity cost? And if you chose option B, what was the opportunity cost? So I think you should pause now and just write down those two answers. Okay. Okay, so this is an example of a question where it's very important to look at what you are being asked. You are being asked for what was the opportunity cost. Okay, you're not being asked which is the best option, which one do you choose. Okay, you're being asked to describe what is the opportunity cost. So if you chose to work at Lulu's, then the opportunity cost is the second thing that you would have done with that time. It is the time that you spend with your uncle, the money that you get paid working with your uncle, and the cake and pizza. Okay, that is how you quantify the opportunity cost of working at Lulu's. It is all of the benefit that you are giving up in order to make that choice. You cannot do the two things with your same time. You choose Lulu's, you necessarily give up the option of working with your uncle. Okay? And on the other hand, if you chose to work for your uncle, what are you giving up? Well, the opportunity cost of working for your uncle is the benefit that you would have gained working at Lulu's. So 10 hours at 3 BD, 30 BD, plus 2 more hours of leisure time. Okay, so you're sacrificing two hours of time also to work for your uncle, because you got to spend a little bit more time, 12 hours on that option. Okay, so the opportunity cost is just quantifying what you have given up. What you have given up is working at Lulu's, that package. Okay.